There's a specific kind of conversation that leaves most people feeling tired. And then there's what it does to a different kind of person. Someone shares something painful with them, a loss, a struggle, a fear they've been carrying alone. And this person receives it fully, stays present, says the right things, holds the space. The conversation ends. The other person leaves feeling lighter. And then this person drives home carrying the weight that was just handed to them. Not thinking about it, feeling it. In their chest. In the particular quality of the silence in the car. Still in it hours later, or the next morning, or 3 days from now when something reminds them and the whole thing comes back like it happened to them personally. Because, in some real, neurological sense, it did. And from the outside, this looks like extraordinary empathy. Like depth. Like the kind of sensitivity that makes someone safe to be around, the person everyone goes to, the one who actually gets it, who never makes you feel like a burden. From the inside, it looks different. From the inside, it looks like a door that won't close. Like a body that takes in other people's emotional experiences and doesn't know how to put them back down. Like moving through the world slightly raw, always, because the channel between yourself and everyone around you is open in ways you don't fully control. And the question nobody has ever quite answered for the person who lives here is this a gift? Or is this a gap where something should be? Psychologist Elaine Hatfield at the University of Hawaii, whose research on what she calls emotional contagion is among the most foundational in the field, documented a mechanism that operates beneath conscious awareness, the automatic, involuntary mimicry of another person's emotional expression. Facial movements, posture, vocal tone. The body copies what it sees and hears in someone else, and through that copying, produces a version of the emotional state itself. This is primitive and universal. Everyone does it to some degree. But for some people, the process doesn't stop at mimicry. The emotional experience that results doesn't stay at the surface. It drops into the body and stays there. And the boundary between what they're feeling and what the other person is feeling becomes, for a while, difficult to locate. That's not a heightened form of empathy. It's a different thing entirely. There's a version of burnout that doesn't look like burnout. It looks like still functioning, still showing up, still being the reliable one. But something underneath has gone quiet. That used to be loud. If you recognize that silence. I've written about exactly this. Link in the description. And in the first pinned comment. Neuroscientist Tanya Singer at the Max Planck Institute has spent years mapping what actually happens in the brain during empathic experience, and what she found reframes how most people think about this. When we witness someone in pain, specific brain regions activate that overlap with the regions associated with our own pain. We share a neural representation of their experience. But in people with what researchers call empathic overarousal, where that shared representation becomes overwhelming and dysregulating, the boundary between the self and the other's experience breaks down. The pain they're witnessing becomes pain they're having. Singer's research also points to something important. This state is distinct from compassion. Compassion involves caring about someone's pain without losing yourself in it. It's stable, sustainable, and actually more useful to the person suffering, because a person who has been flooded by your pain is no longer fully present to help you with it. They're managing their own response. The person who absorbs everyone's pain is often, paradoxically, less available in the moments that matter most, not because they don't care, but because they care so completely that the capacity for clear, stable presence gets overwhelmed. And here's where this comes from. John Bowlby's work on emotional development and the decades of attachment research that followed documented what happens when a child is placed in the role of emotional caretaker. When the child's primary task over years is to track and regulate the emotional state of a caregiver, to read their face before speaking, to calibrate their own mood to the others, to make the adult feel better. The distinction between your feeling and my feeling never fully consolidates. Because consolidating it, maintaining a boundary between their inner world and the adults, would have felt, in that context, like abandonment. The child who remained fused with the parent's emotional state was performing the most important function available to them. Being separate felt dangerous. And the nervous system learned, stay close to the feeling. Don't let the distance between you and it grow. That architecture carries forward. into friendships where they take on emotional loads that aren't theirs, into relationships where other people's distress is experienced as their own emergency, into the specific exhaustion of never quite having a clean emotional slate because there's always something from someone else still processing through a system that was never designed to hold this much of it. And there's something else, something that makes this harder than it sounds to name from the inside. They often can't tell which emotions are theirs. By the end of a day that involved several emotionally heavy conversations, they don't know if the heaviness they're feeling belongs to them or is a residue of what they absorbed from others. They mistake other people's sadness for their own mood. They sometimes carry anxiety for days that turns out, on reflection, to have originated in someone else's situation. The boundary between self and other, in the emotional register, is so permeable that basic self-knowledge becomes difficult. What do I actually feel, right now, separate from what everyone around me is feeling? For most people, that question has an easy answer. For the person who absorbs everyone's pain, it sometimes doesn't. And here's what almost nobody tells them. This isn't just sensitivity. Sensitivity is a trait, a higher responsiveness to input. What this is something structural. A boundary that didn't form under the conditions where it was supposed to. Not because something went wrong with the person. Because something was required of them, early, that left that boundary undeveloped in order to serve a different function. The boundary can be built. Not easily. Not without loss. Because building it means tolerating a felt distance from others that will, at first, feel like abandonment in the body even when the mind knows it isn't. But it can be built. And the goal isn't to feel less. People who absorb pain often fear that if they develop better emotional boundaries, they'll become cold, inaccessible, less of who they are. That's not what happens. What happens is that the empathy becomes more sustainable. The care becomes more stable. They can be genuinely present for someone's pain without disappearing into it. And when the conversation ends, they return to themselves, not immediately, not perfectly, but more than before. The person who absorbs everyone's pain isn't more compassionate than other people. They're more porous. And there's a version of sensitivity that is genuinely a gift, and a version that is a gap where a boundary should be. Learning to tell the difference is what changes everything. And here's what that shift actually feels like for the people who've made it. Not less sensitive. That's the fear that building better emotional boundaries means becoming less present, less available, less of the person who people can bring their hardest things to. But that's not what happens. What happens is something more specific. They begin to develop the ability to be with someone's pain without becoming it. To be genuinely present in a conversation about suffering, not managed from a distance, not behind glass, but actually there, while still remaining oriented in their own body. Still knowing what's theirs and what isn't. Still able to return to themselves when the conversation ends. That's not less compassion. It's more sustainable compassion. The kind that doesn't deplete itself in the first hour and leave the person with nothing for themselves afterward. For most people who absorb pain, this shift doesn't come from learning a technique. It comes from finally understanding that the dissolution of boundaries wasn't empathy. It was a survival strategy that was formed before they had the capacity to choose differently. And understanding that for the first time makes choosing differently possible. Not all at once. Not permanently. But enough. And enough is worth defining, because for people who absorb pain, it rarely looks the way they expect. They expect, when they imagine having better emotional boundaries, something that feels like protection. A wall. A distance. The capacity to hear something painful and remain untouched by it, clean, separate, in full possession of their own interior. That's not what develops. What develops is something closer to permeability with anchoring. The emotional door doesn't close. It becomes more deliberate. The person can still feel the weight of someone else's experience. The capacity for empathic resonance that was always there remains fully available. What changes is the recovery. What changes is the return to themselves once the contact ends. Tanya Singer's distinction between empathic distress and compassion points directly at this. Compassion, in her research, is associated with positive effect even in the presence of someone's pain. Not because the compassionate person is unmoved, they are. but because they've maintained enough contact with their own center that the pain doesn't collapse the boundary between self and other. They can feel with someone without becoming that person's feeling. This is the direction the recovery moves in. Not toward less feeling. Toward more self, more access to the interior that was always there, but rarely consulted when someone else's experience filled the room. And the specific cost of building this, the one nobody mentions, is that it requires tolerating, for a while, the discomfort of not losing yourself in someone else's pain, which, for a person who has organized their sense of presence around that dissolution, can feel, initially, like absence rather than growth. It isn't. It's the opposite. The shift doesn't happen all at once. It usually starts with a single moment, a conversation that goes nowhere, a phone that stays silent when you needed it to ring, a realization so quiet you almost missed it, that you've been there for everyone, and no one has really been there for you. If you're somewhere near that moment right now, I have something for you. Link in the description. And in the first pinned comment. Now I want to ask you something directly. Do you know what your own emotional baseline feels like? Not how you feel after a conversation, or during a difficult week, or when you've been around someone who is struggling. Your actual baseline, the emotional tone that is specifically yours, separate from whatever is happening around you. For many people who absorb pain, that baseline is difficult to access. Because there's so rarely a clean stretch of time where they're only inside their own experience, and no one else's. And this one, the last time you felt genuinely okay, not managing something, not recovering from something, just okay. How long did it take to get there from the last heavy conversation you were in? If the honest answer is measured in days rather than hours, that's worth paying attention to. Not as evidence that something is wrong with you, as evidence of what you're being asked to carry, and how long you've been carrying it without the right kind of support. Because the people who benefit most from your porousness, the ones who leave conversations lighter, the ones who come to you first, the ones who always know you'll hold it, most of them don't know what it costs you. Not because they're selfish, because you've never shown them the cost. Because the door doesn't close, but it also doesn't show from the outside what's accumulating behind it. You're allowed to decide who gets access to that door. Not to close it permanently, that would cost you something real, something that is genuinely yours. But to choose more deliberately whose pain you're willing to carry and for how long, and under what conditions. That's not coldness. That's the beginning of having something left. If this video put words to something you've been living inside, leave a comment. Tell me what it's like to feel other people's pain as your own. I read everything. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the next video goes into something that lives right next to this one. What happens when the door that was always open finally needs to close, and how you do it without losing what made you who you are.